Bienvenidos, Ushamdi, and welcome Anne Arundel Community College learners taking the CTS-233 Section 400 Network Programmability course for the Spring 2023 semester. This is the Cisco Network Academy's DEVASC 200-901 Certification Exam Preparation course, and in this, our final video on Part 4 of Lab 3.6.6, where we're parsing different data types with Python, we're now going to dive in and see how we can parse YAML data, and YAML stands for yet another markup language, right? So another way to present data. We've seen XML, we've seen JSON, and we've seen YAML. And if I was to prioritize these for this course, and, depending on what it is you're doing, I would say number one is going to be JSON, JavaScript Object Notation. Remember, these are not programming languages. These are data representation formats, right? It's how you would present data in a specific format. We saw XML with all those lovely tags I can't stand. We saw JSON, super simple, super easy, because the JSON data types pretty much align with the Python data types. So super simple. Now we're going to take a look at YAML, yet another markup language, and what we would have to do to use YAML. And again, you're going to see YAML quite a bit. Again, depending on what you do. If you're doing REST API work, you're probably going to see a lot of JSON unless you're asking for the data back in XML format. We are going to be focused on JSON really in this course. That's where I think 95% of the data formatting that we're going to be working with is JSON. But let's dive in here and let's knock out part 4 of Lab 3.6.6. So here we are again. In order to work with the data set and to see the output that I'm going to see here in this video tutorial, you need to have the DevASC virtual machine. If you don't despair. You could simulate the data that you're going to see. Again, I'm going to show you all of the YAML files that we're going to be working with here in this video, which is parseyaml.py and myfile.yaml. And again, the myfile.yaml, if I was to cat that out, myfile.yaml, this is the data, the YAML data, and that's the format for YAML. As I said in the JSON video, typically you see a YAML file started with 3 dashes. Again, that is not a mandatory convention. It's a good practice. And then we have how YAML presents the data. And you can see it's a little bit different than JSON, right? We don't have curly braces here, and we don't have dictionary-like key value pairs with the quotes around everything. In a YAML file, it's just simply access underscore token is your key, and then there's your value. Expires in is your key, and there's your value. So maybe you like YAML a little bit better because we don't have to have the quotes around everything, and we don't have to have the curly braces involved. And so YAML is pretty straightforward and pretty simple. Now you might be asking, well, wait a second, if it doesn't have the curly braces and it's got those 3 dashes at the top, how in the world is JSON going to handle this? And that's what we're about to see right now. So let's go ahead and dive in here. I'm going to pull up the parseyaml.py file. Now, when you start, you're only going to have the single line up here. I've gone ahead, typed it up so you don't have to watch me sit here and type it with all of the typos that would probably happen. But let's take a look at what we've got so far at the very top. So again, you're going to see that we're going to import JSON, or the JavaScript Object Notation library, because we need access to some of its methods and features and functionality. What about import YAML? Now, the lab actually mentions in part 4, it says that this lab uses PyYAML to parse a YAML file. Now, this always causes confusion because learners always ask, well, why don't I have import, whoops, sorry, didn't want to do that. Why don't I have import PyYAML like that? Well, that's because when you import YAML, you are importing PyYAML, right? And so keep in mind that you don't import PyYAML using the name PyYAML. You just simply import YAML. And the PyYAML library is just part of the YAML library that we import. I hope I said that right, or I hope I'm saying that clearly, right? So you don't import PyYAML. It's included when you import YAML with the statement right there. We'll leave it at that. All right, so that was the reference to PyYAML. So now let's go ahead and dive in. We've seen what the myfile.yaml file looks like, but we've got to open that file for reading, right? Remember, with open and the comma with the R inside the single quotes, you don't see that here The reason that you don't see that here is because that's the default. So I don't need to have it here. Maybe for readability, it makes it a little bit easier, but if you're using with open, then you should know that the default is read. Now, I could have said as F or as file or as JSON file or as YAML file or whatever. Here, I'm just going to leave it as file. And now we have a file object, right? So when we say with open and we're opening this file, that is the file object representation, the variable name that we're going to use here that represents that file object. So what are we going to do? Okay, well, here's what ends up happening when we use the YAML.safe_load. So again, we've imported the YAML library. Here is the method safe_load. So what is safe_load all about? Well, keep in mind that when we use that YAML safe_load, and the reason that the word safe is in there is because it only allows us to load in simple Python data types. Like think of an integer, a string, a dictionary, a list. And so YAML.safe_load is what we want to use because we don't want arbitrary data, possibly data that could hijack the system or the website or whatever the case may be. So we use safe load, which is going to check to make sure, hey, am I basically getting a simple Python object here? And the answer is going to be yes, right? And so YAML data is going to be our variable name. We're going to say YAML.safe_load, and that's going to load it in. And again, we're just working with a simple data type. It's going to parse the YAML file, and it's creating a JSON formatted output. And that's what this line is doing. Again, it's parsing the YAML file. Safe load is going to produce for us the JSON output, which this variable name represents, YAML data. And again, it's the YAML data being represented in, you can think of it as JSON format, and then Python, now that we've put it into JSON format, Python can now treat it just like a dictionary. And we can parse that data just as if it was a Python dictionary, or if there was a list in there, or if there were whatever in there, right? But this line right here is critical. That is giving us the YAML file, myfile.yaml, in JSON format, and it's safe loading it to make sure that that's all we're doing. And we are going to go ahead and print that out right here. So we are going to see a JSON object, which is a Python dictionary, printed out to the screen first. Then we're going to print out the values that we parse out, which is the access token and the expires in. We're going to put 2 carriage returns in there to put some spaces, and then we're going to do the JSON dumps. You might have been curious as to like, well, wait a second, if we're parsing, we're loading the YAML librarian, why am I importing JSON? Because we just did that in the previous lab in part 3. Well, the reason we're doing the JSON dumps is because now that YAML data, right? YAML data is a Python object now, right? That represents the data that was in that myfile.yaml file. And so it represents it. It looks like it's a dictionary. And so JSON dumps is basically going to dump that information out, and it's going to put it out to the screen. The JSON dumps, think of the S as representing the word serialize or string, right? So we're going to serialize a Python object to a JSON formatted string. That's what the S means, because there is a json.dump, which is singular. That is used when you're trying to write to a file, like we would go with open and we would open it for writing or maybe appending. But the idea is the singular form of this method, JSON dump, is used for writing to files. When we have the plural, JSON dumps, what we're doing is we're taking a Python object, that same Python object that we created up here, when we ran the YAML safe load on that file and got this Python object, which is going to be formatted like a dictionary. And now we can use JSON dumps to take that same Python object, the dictionary object, and we can put it into a JSON formatted string. We serialize it and get a string with that S, right? Okay, so, and then the indentation argument that we give is we're going to indent 4 spaces, right? So it's kind of pretty formatted. So let's see what this looks like when we go ahead and we run it. Let's clear our screen. Let's say Python 3. parseyaml.py. And so again, here is that YAML file right out of the gate. And where does it end? Whoops, I think I went too far there. There we go. Where does it end? So this is the exact same YAML data, right? When we saw it was just, you know, the key value pairs and it started with the 3 dashes at the top. We converted it, right? With the safe load, we converted it into a Python object, a dictionary. And so here it is. So Python looked at that YAML data and said, yeah, I've got key value pairs in here. Boom, I'm going to safe load this. Here is what that looks like as a Python data type, a dictionary. And then what do? Well, we parsed into that dictionary. And what did we get out of it? Well, we got out the 2 values that we were looking for, the access token and the expiration of the token. Then we've got our 2. And it looks like it actually is 2, because there's a return here at the end, it looks like, carriage return. So we have our 2 new lines here, and then what do we have? Here is the result of our JSON dumps. We take a Python dictionary data type, right, which is that YAML data variable, that's what it's holding, and we dump it out as a string, as a JSON string. And that's what it looks like. And you can see the indent 4. This is the and actually, whoops, sorry. I want to go back here. Let's see if I can get it. 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's the indent of 4 for each key value pair. And that is how easy it is to parse YAML data and to get it into JSON format or to get it into a Python dictionary format. So let's take a final look here at myfile.yaml. So that was the YAML data that we started with. And then how did we parse it? Well, let's go ahead and cat parseyaml.py. And this is how we did it. And the key, right, all the magic kind of happens right here. When we convert that YAML data, we safe load it into a Python simple data type like a dictionary. And that's exactly what we did. And so then as soon as we have YAML data, right, which we captured here when we did the YAML safe load, as soon as we have that YAML data, now it looks like a Python dictionary. So I can parse and seek into it and pull the data out that I want. And I could even dump it back out as a JSON string. I could serialize it as a JSON string and indent 4 spaces. All right, well, that is going to conclude Lab 3.6.6, which is a really good lab to walk through. We parsed XML, we parsed JSON, we parsed YAML, and we saw how we could do some different conversions. All right, this is going to become important as we move into Module 4 and start to work with REST APIs, especially being able to parse the JSON data. All right, thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know if you have any questions, and as always, I hope to see you in the next video.